Greetings, everyone. A very warm welcome to you all to the first webinar of our Spring 2024 series. The webinar is hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, the climate science lead at the center, co-hosting this webinar with my colleagues, Kira Clark-Wolf and Haley Rowe. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the north central US that encompasses the Missouri and the upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speakers, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat anytime during the webinar, and we will start with those questions first during the Q&A in the order they are received. And now I'm very excited to introduce Scott Somershoe, our speaker for today. Scott works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a land bird coordinator for the mountain prairie region and helps support conservation and research on declining birds like Sprague's pipit, pig-billed and chestnut-collared longspurs, bay-headed sparrow, mountain plover, and Pinyon Jay. In the last 2 years, his work has shifted to working primarily on Pinyon Jays and Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. Scott grew up near Philadelphia and attended a college at Millersville University. After college, he moved to Georgia, where he earned a master's in biology at Georgia Southern University. Scott lived and worked in the Southeast for 17 years before moving to Colorado in 2015. The title for today's webinar is Conservation and Management Challenges for a Poorly Understood Declining Species in a Changing Landscape. Well, thank you, Scott, for your time and interest in presenting this work, and please take it away.
Thanks, Imtiaz. Appreciate that. Appreciate the invitation to come speak today, and to everyone for taking the time to be here in your busy schedules. I'm going to give a little background on Pinyon Jays, since most of you probably don't eat, breathe, and sleep jays, and then kind of dive into Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, climate change impacts that we're seeing now, predicted changes into the future, and what this looks like through the eyes of a Pinyon Jay, and then roll this up into an overview of an approach that could help us tackle these challenges across, it's essentially the Intermountain West. There we go. So why Pinyon Jays? Why all the hubbub? Long-term population declines. This is breeding bird survey data that started in the late 60s. So USGS and John Sauer and his shop have done analyses of trends and annual changes. The information at the top here, we're looking at 2.5% per year decline for the last 50 years or so. Overall population decline was almost 84%. And this came out in the 2016 Partners in Flight Land Bird Plan. Pretty startling number. They've had, we've got more data, some updated analyses, and so that's maybe about 63% decline. Still pretty dramatic. And then Adam Smith with the Canadian Wildlife Service is taking the same data, done Bayesian analyses, got very similar types of trends, about 2.5% per year decline, about 72% overall population loss from 1970 to 2021. So a little bit of variation there, but the patterns are the same. We're looking at the same kind of trajectory. And I get asked a lot about trends. We have more Pinyon-Juniper woodlands than ever. So why are they declining? And, I say it's largely about habitat quality, not quantity, and I'll get to that. And I'm also asked when I hear questions about trend reliability, uncertainty in Pinyon Jay or BBS data, because it's collected after the breeding season for Pinyon Jays, which is kind of ends around mid-May typically. And I'll explain why I think the trends are pretty realistic with what we're seeing across the landscape. And it's also kind of nuanced for jays for a variety of reasons. But what's interesting is jays are generally declining across the board, whereas other Pinyon-Juniper woodland dependent species or obligates are stable or increasing. There are some recent declines in the last 20 years of a few species at state levels, but by and large, it's jays, and they're kind of in a different situation than the rest of the species in the PJ. So a little background on jays. They use the landscape. They have huge home ranges. They're a flocking bird. They maintain 18 to 15,000 acre home ranges. So the images that you see here are from the same spot looking opposite directions in the Pine Nut Mountains in western Nevada. The image on the left is sort of that young juniper expanding or reestablishing in the sagebrush steppe. Jays cache pine nuts, search for insects out there. They spend a lot of time wandering around out in that kind of early successional ecotone. The image on the right, we've got sort of that mature PJ with mature mass-producing age trees, open woodlands, lots of shrub understory, whether it's sagebrush, greasewood, or something else, depending on where you are. So they're foraging there, they're nesting in that kind of stuff, and then they typically roost in closed canopied woodlands. So that's sort of the point is they use all of this. So they're using all this during the daily and annual cycle. Another example from Western Nevada. I know this is not the Colorado Plateau, but I'm setting up the stage here. Big PJ stand, jays nested in the back of this. And then they all fly about 1.5 miles over grass and sagebrush. I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, I don't think so, but sort of halfway up the mountains, you've got that hard edge where the conifers have been cut back to that hard PJ edge. There's a drainage there, and they all roost. They fly to roost in that area every night. So covering a huge area, lots of movement daily and throughout the annual cycle makes surveys difficult, challenging, lots of details behind that. And so one more slide of pictures kind of give you the idea. Lots of different types of pinyon and juniper woodlands, and also pine woodlands and junipers. So we've got Grand Canyon, Southwest Colorado, different woodland types. Up in Montana, jays nest in juniper and limber pine areas, but there's jays in Oregon where there's no pinyon, and they're in areas in eastern Montana and Wyoming and Nebraska. Different systems yet. And so part of the take home here is what we know about jays in one place very well may not be applicable in other places, even within the same state. Makes it pretty challenging. So I get asked, why are jays declining quite a lot? And my answer is typically, it's complicated. And we don't really know. And so I'm not going to go through all of these different potential causes of decline one at a time and break into them. I think one of the take homes here is they're not independent. There's a lot of potential causes of decline, both locally and at larger scales. There's a lot of interaction. I think it highlights the need for science on jays and in PJ woodlands. But broadly speaking, changes in woodland structure, we're seeing changes in pinyon juniper woodlands, higher biomass, more closed canopy woodlands than we saw, historically for lots of reasons. Habitat loss, whether it's removal of habitat for other management objectives that don't have woodlands as a value, or mortality from drought, stand replacing fires, insect and disease outbreaks. And that rolls right into a changing climate. Hotter, drier conditions, tree mortality, reduced mass production, all those other things are changing the woodlands. And something else we haven't gotten into a whole lot until more recently was talking about common raven predation and nesting colonies. Pretty good anecdotal evidence that they're able to wipe out colonies. Need some more information on that specifically, but that could be a real issue in some places. So this is a picture in the Great Basin. I realize it's not the Colorado Plateau, but it's fairly descriptive and informative of what I'm trying to, the kind of points that I'm trying to make. So this map was developed by John Boone and Elizabeth Amon from the Great Basin Bird Observatory, with 20 years of Nevada bird count data. And a couple of mountain ranges here, you can kind of see this U of a mountain and a little eye off to the left here. And the deeper the red, the higher relative abundance of Pinyon Jays. And if you notice, it's always lower on slopes on the mountains, kind of the base of the mountains, and out into the ecotone, out into the sagebrush is where these birds spend most of their time. And so John and with Chris Witt with the Forest Service are working on a paper that is showing foraging habitat may be limited in these areas as a result of management in these changing ecosystems. But one of the take homes here is We don't necessarily know the impact of individual treatments. Well, there's a 500-acre treatment, but that accumulation of treatments over time. So say within that oval that I put up there, a lot of the mature trees that are mass producing age at the base of those mountains, that could be impacting foraging, that could be affecting nesting success, versus a lot of the low density PJ that's way out into the sage. Jays are not nesting in there. They've probably planted some of those trees. Probably not seeing impacts of jays. So it's a very nuanced, depends where you are, depends what the situation is. But thinking about that accumulation of treatments over time when we're altering these landscapes and potential causes of decline. But we don't really know what's going on with jays. We're going to work on that. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So one of the ideas that I've been thinking about for a while, I know I'm a bird guy. I read a lot of PJ literature and read a lot of climate stuff, related stuff. Is, generally speaking, pinyon pines have this mast cycle where we have a big mast event, lots of pine nuts are produced, kind of synchronously across the geography, generally speaking, of course. Then there's not a lot of nut production for a few years, and then there's a peak, and then there's another valley with small events in between. And so thanks to decades of research on jays in Arizona, we know the year after that mast event, jays have a higher percentage of birds that breed out of the flock, and juvenile survival tends to be pretty high. So jays population should see a big boom after those big mast events. And then years with little mast or no mast, they may not breed at all. And we saw that in Utah, eastern Utah and western Colorado in 2021. The year after drought, there was no mast. Most of the jay colonies had no birds in them. And a few birds attempted to nest kind of in mid-May, which is 2.5 months late. So how often are they deferring breeding is a big question. So this gets to my next little pretty picture is, this historical mast cycle, and those masting events are less frequent. We hear about this a lot. It's very anecdotal. We don't have a lot of hard evidence on changes in cone production and masting events. But we hear a lot of like, used to have this, this entire valley would be covered in mast and there'd be tons of pine nuts. But now it's like on one hillside and it's fairly local and much smaller scale. So I'm trying to make a little visual, a little scribble on here of those events are less frequent and they're at smaller scales, and thinking about that from a jay perspective. So we don't really have hard data behind this per se, but we do have a lot of information from that woodland standpoint. So Dr. Miranda Redmond in Berkeley has shown that Pinus edulis has reduced cone production with increasing growing season temperatures. Dr. Andreas Wyon and his colleagues have found that in drier areas have a higher annual variation in mast and typically smaller crops. So this sort of lends to this idea of the cycles are changing. And then thinking about jay lifespan, they live average 5-6 years. Obviously they can live 10-12 years. They can hit a couple of those big mast events, but maybe they hit 1 or 2 and now they hit 0 or 1. And how important are those big mast events versus sort of smaller masting events? And getting that population boom to get to the next masting event. How often can birds defer breeding and maintain a flock on the landscape? And so this, even though we don't have a lot of hard data behind this, it really supports the observations from, say, Chris Johnson, New Mexico, who had flocks of 400, 500 birds, and now they're 150 or 100 birds. In southern New Mexico, they were 75, 80 birds, and now they're 25 to 35 birds. We still see birds. Those flocks are sort of winnowing down, and this is a potential driver of that. All kind of makes sense, but it gets to that big question. If you're probably sitting there scratching your head going, like, well, how do we conserve a species that's potentially being negatively impacted by climate change? You have to manage for those woodlands. You have to try to maintain it where you can, make it more climate resilient into the future, thinking about it from that woodland perspective. And this is where you get back to that quality over quantity kind of question. So getting back to those trends, that almost 84% population decline, which is pretty stark, realized we ought to be paying attention to Pinyon Jays a little bit. So we started a Pinyon Jay working group. There were a whopping 7 of us on that first call. Obviously, that's grown a lot. The evolution of this group continues. We put out a conservation strategy in February 2020, right before the pandemic. Good literature review, outlined research and information needs, conservation actions that could be beneficial or maybe not negative to jays, lots of unknowns, and this has led to a lot of research. There's a lot of research getting started, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But this is also pretty fortuitous because we got a petition, the service got a petition from Defenders of Wildlife to list Pinyon Jay under the Endangered Species Act in April 2022. So we're already had partners talking, we're already getting engaged with jays, which was quite beneficial to the big picture here. So some of the products that the working group has put out, and this kind of leads into stuff I'm going to get into later in my presentation today. But when we started all this stuff, like, well, we need a repeatable, robust, statistically rigorous sampling methodology to find jays. We can't just drive around and find jays and monitor trends very well that way. We need something more than that. So we did surveys in Colorado and Utah for a few years with the state and BLM and the service, and worked through a variety of different protocols and methodology kept changing. And a team of us with folks that have spent a couple decades working on jays collectively and developing multiple protocols help get this landscape applications protocol to the finish line with the steering committee of the working group. And so basically this is coordinated bird monitoring. Jays are hard to work on. They're really difficult. You can waste a lot of time if you don't know what you're doing and getting up that learning curve. But it's basic data standards. So this isn't a comprehensive, this is all the vegetation you should be recording. That's on the user. But this is the survey methodology, how you lay it out on the landscape, learning about behaviors. What are the birds doing? It's incredibly meaningful. Just because you saw birds is not necessarily biologically useful. But it makes a lot of data comparable across survey efforts. And so in 2024, several states are doing statewide surveys. Some states that are new to the jay business are starting to figure out some of this, and which is great because it's in parts of the range where we know nothing about the bird, essentially. And we're going to meet in a few weeks to talk about coordinated range-wide surveys and what that could look like. And so as soon as we got done one protocol, we realized we needed to do a second because we get lots of questions. We're going to do a woodland treatment. We're going to do some thinning here. Do we have jays? It's a very different type of question, and that's not what that landscape applications protocol is for. And so Arizona Game and Fish contracted with Great Basin Bird Observatory and basically took the landscape applications protocol and scaled it down a few less sidebars, because you don't have to be in a grid. You can survey that plot repeatedly, sort of as a survey, clearance survey or a discovery survey, whatever you want to call it, to understand if you have jays in that project area before you do a treatment. And then Colorado Parks and Wildlife developed a similar, slightly different protocol to ask the same kind of question, which works really well in Colorado. And so we'll have both of those protocols with some information about each on the Pinyon Jay Working Group webpage, hopefully in a couple weeks. So something else we're working to get to the finish line is a predictive occurrence model for jays. So when we sort of got into all of this several years ago, we had a breeding bird survey, like from the Dren's data I talked about, breeding bird survey model that was stop level just within the sagebrush ecosystem. So Jason Tack, who's in our HAPET program within refuges, had done that for the sage effort with sagebrush obligate songbirds and some other PJ obligates. And we're like, well, this is great, but let's expand this range wide for jays. So we roped in a whole lot of partners in all the states across the range of the bird, pulled in a lot more data, both breeding season for jays, which is March through mid-May, and the typical migratory bird breeding period, which is mid-May through June-ish. So this model's early season breeding and early summer model. Hopefully we'll get to the finish line fairly soon. Part of the idea behind this is to help inform where surveys should be done, where have a higher likelihood of finding jays, and not be used to zoom in and make a management decision. That's not what this is designed for. But this is also, this is version 1. There's already things that are not quite right. We've gone through a bunch of iterations to get it to where it is now. But we're going to learn more. We already have more data that was collected last year that could be incorporated. In 2 years, when we have a whole lot more data, we can refine this model. So coming out of the conservation strategy, it was pretty much lots of unknowns. Don't know the limiting factors that causes the decline of the species. I'm not going to go through all of these, but sort of the take home is there's not a whole lot that we know. There's some things we know moderately well, a lot of stuff that we don't know. It's kind of funny. We're in 2024, and there's one big study on adult and juvenile survival of the species. That's it. It's a difficult bird to work on, and there was lots of reasons why we don't have this information. But we're starting to get at this stuff. So there's been some projects in the last few years looking at woodland management or nesting success. All the stuff that's sort of in that circled area is getting started in some capacity or has been wrapped up somewhere within the range of the bird, which is pretty exciting. And this gets back to the question of the two questions I have there on the left of, how can we manage woodlands with or for jays? And how can we turn trends around? I don't know that we have the answers to that yet. So some of the ongoing science or some of the gee whiz kind of fun stuff that's going on in the jay world, which lends nicely into the PJ stuff I'm going to get into. Filling information gaps on sort of land use, potential management impacts, positive or negative or neutral, and sort of the approaches. How are birds using this managed landscape? It's not like there's virgin historical PJ all over the place. Everything's been grazed or treated or something's happened to it over the last, many decades. How are jays using this landscape? So realize it's a crazy map. Black outlines the sagebrush ecosystem. That purple layer through the middle is the breeding bird survey model that Jason Tackett developed for us for the sagebrush effort. The blue is sagebrush obligate songbirds and sage grouse high relative abundance. So deeper the blue, higher sagebrush birds in those areas, so to speak. So we overlaid all that kind of stuff to kind of see where that overlap is, because there's a lot in a lot of places and we need to understand that. And so this is starting to try to get at those questions. And so a few projects going on. Start with that red line. That's sort of the divide. East of that line is the Colorado Plateau. West is the Great Basin, more or less. So we have two students largely funded with service funds and BLM working at University of Georgia, sitting next to one another. Hannah Wright is working in the orange circle in eastern Utah, northern New Mexico, lots of surveys, tagging birds. And Emily Card is about to start her first field season working in the Eastern Great Basin, doing the same work, same tags, protocols, etc. Try to understand how jays are using the bases of the mountains and how they're moving around, and what they're using and what they're not using. The yellow circle is Rory Eggleston. She's at Utah State under Dr. Dave Dahlgren, doing the same kind of work, working up in the southern Idaho with Intermountain Bird Observatory in northwest Utah, which is great. Lots of cross-pollination and protocols and lessons learned from tags and all that kind of stuff with Rory. And then Emily Macklin is working in that blue circle off to the right in central Colorado with Royal Gorge BLM Field Office, looking at woodland treatments and thinnings, jay use, finding nesting colonies, going to develop a colony model, see if we can't predict kind of where are there patterns of where we find colonies on the landscape. So some of the GWIS stuff coming out of this is some of the first satellite telemetry data that we've got off of jays. So this is from Hannah's work in eastern Utah from last year. So each of these images are two birds for about 2 weeks, lots of battery issues, software issues, figuring out the tag thing. Can't just do it in the lab. We had to throw tags on birds and figure out what worked and wasn't working. But sort of one of the take homes here is they're using a huge geography. You can see that scale. Birds are spread out, up to 8 miles back and forth. There's sort of a, core area in the middle where they spend a lot of their time, but they do a lot of wandering. And a few of those points are probably wonky, particularly after you put on a tag, it'll often give you a point from 400 miles away, which is obviously wrong. So a little vetting needs to be done, but starting to get an idea of how much space they use for a short period of time and the conservation challenges that go with that. So one of Hannah's birds that didn't stick around took off. This was an adult jay. Did not have breeding condition on May 7th. Maybe it didn't breed at all. And it flew nearly 100 miles over 18 days before the battery died. What's interesting here, or a lot of interesting things here, that the bird kind of hugged that PJ at the base of the mountains, made some pretty big jumps to other patches of PJ. Don't know if that bird came back. Got lots of questions, but for lots of different aspects, but really interesting kind of stuff. When Rory Eggleston I mentioned has had a bird do something sort of similar. She was tagging birds in the Bovine Mountains in northwest Utah. And the Great Salt Lake is in the top right of that image there. And this bird over about 7 or 8 weeks made a couple different trips that are 30, 40 mile, 50-mile round trips out in the Nevada and came back to where it was tagged, and another big trip and came back. And then at one point it flew pretty far south. Like if you look at that scale there, we're talking a couple 100 kilometers from where it was banded in August, September, early October 2023. All the yellow, I guess I should have mentioned, is modeled PJ under Landfire, I believe. So the bird's really hugging the base of the mountains, which is what we think they're doing. Lots of questions about what this bird was doing. Unfortunately, the battery died, the tag died. I don't know what happened, if it came back or if it kept going. But kind of reinforces that, like, we need to understand the species. We need to understand PJ woodland ecosystems and what's going on. This is more challenging and fascinating than, I think a lot of us were expecting. So this is all fine and dandy. Science is awesome, super cool. We need to do it. It's really, really important. We need to get after that stuff, but we can't slow or reverse declines of jays with just on the jay science. We're seeing huge changes in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. They're very well documented in the literature. I've got some pictures here from my travels of direct tree mortality, like from the climate change situation. This is Mesa Verde with a massive fire. The woodlands have been replaced basically by invasive annual grasses. Without massive effort, we're not going to get trees back in that. We're not going to have PJ back in that area. We're seeing that increased infill, lots of very high tree density. We're seeing reduced tree vigor. We're seeing tree dieback as well. That reduced recruitment, reduced pine mast production. Seeing lots of big changes. It really reinforces the need to understand woodland dynamics, the changes that we're seeing, and the response and resilience to disturbance as well. And then how can we manage for woodland values and that climate resilience into the future, not just for jays, but for that woodland ecosystem. There's a lot of things that depend on Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. So many have probably seen this paper from Adam Knoll and colleagues that came out back in May. It was really, really fascinating stuff. I realize I'm the bird guy, but I read more PJ papers than anything at this point, and it's all incredibly relevant. And the figures here are for Pinyon-Juniper species by species, got recruitment rate on the Y, mortality rate on the X, and kind of a threshold of population growth or loss, essentially, for each of the species. And so the take home here on the Colorado Plateau, Pinus edulis and Juniperus monosperma are seeing under multiple climate scenarios to the end of century, decreased recruitment and increased mortality rates. So that's a population decline rate. That is not good. So we're looking at potentially a significant chunk of the range of each of these species being less suitable and trees being lost. So obviously there's big implications there if you're a Pinyon Jay or you're dependent on Pinyon-Juniper woodlands for a myriad of reasons. So I got to meet Adam back in October at a workshop where I met Imitaz, and Adam presented a lot of this stuff. And thanks to Adam for sharing a bunch of slides with me of stuff that they're working towards getting published. So the image here is Pinus edulis's current suitability across the Colorado Plateau. So there's not, the yellow is high current suitability, so that's not all across Wyoming or eastern plains of Colorado per se, but within the four corner states, within those circles that are highlighted there, generally speaking, that's, where Pinus edulis has the stronghold. But if we look towards the end of century, just under one emission scenario, that yellow, not a direct translation, but turns red. So much reduced habitat suitability for the species. So this doesn't mean all the trees are going to die, but it's not a pretty picture. We already know a lot of places are seeing lots of tree mortality, both on Pinyon and the Juniper side. Here's kind of a visual of that, of what we could expect by the end of the century. This is a pretty bad situation. Obviously, this doesn't account for dispersal of trees or other disturbance events, but sort of that big picture potential change into the future. And so, of course, when talking to Adam and John, I'm like, well, what's the reliability of this? Is this what we actually expect to happen? Well, I was presented on some of that stuff, and they're working on getting that published, writing that up. And so they've done that. And so they took that model, did a species distribution model for Pinus edulis with climate data from 11 different future prediction models, and the robust data for both robust models, the really dark colors on here, the dark blue, the dark red, have high model projection agreement on the direction of that change. So this is, kind of backing up. Yes, we may see these changes, but all the climate models are sort of aligning on this, which is really scary. So in this case, blue is currently highly suitable for Pinus edulis. It will likely stay that way by end of century. Whereas the red and the maroon and the pink is likely to not become suitable into the future, drop below that threshold of suitability. Really, really concerning for lots of reasons. This ecosystem is really in crisis, and here's some data to kind of show what this trajectory may look like. So this raises lots of questions about PJ. It's pretty concerning if you're a Pinyon Jay, you're dependent on Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, and it really reinforces that need to manage these woodlands where appropriate for Pinyon-Juniper woodland values, thinking about woodlands into the future, 100 years, 200 years in the future, managing for recruitment, and through that future forest. We have to think long-term. So a lot of that kind of work is getting started. Ali Urza at Berkeley and Ian Barrett with Colorado BLM, Fuel Shop, and Jason Reinhardt, Forest Service are doing opportunities to do some huge experiments within woodlands and doing different types of treatments, and looking at woodland response, not just the trees, but soils, the forbs and grasses and everything in between, which is going to be critically important for us to understand how we can manage these woodlands into the future, and for them to be more climate resilient. So obviously I see this as a big opportunity to learn Jay stuff. Let's overlay the Jay work and figure out what's going on. So we'll get an over respiratory thing. So I'm looking on a cough drop here. So the previous couple slides showed predicted shift of Pinus edulis or conifers into new places. So I asked Adam and John last time we met, like, well, what's there now? Is that going to move into existing PJ or into like pond pine or sagebrush? Like, where is this going to move into? And is that like possible? Like, how realistic is this? Well, they've already done a lot of that. So I've done that climate resistant, robust analyses with those data. Here's sort of Colorado Plateau, and these black areas here in eastern Utah, these sort of arcs, and in western Colorado and some other places have a high likelihood of conifers moving into sagebrush by the end of the century. So that raises lots of questions about like management and what we could do, where we let things go. How do we make decisions? How do we deal with this? We're already seeing lots of shifts in conifer, and efforts to balance that for different management objectives. So we're seeing lots of changes. There's lots of predicted changes into the future with a pretty high probability of occurring by the end of the century. And that keeps me thinking about management and the nuance of all of this. It's obviously very complicated. It's also very site-specific. And there's lots of priorities in this part of the world, and whether it's sagebrush integrity and sage grouse, fuels and fire mitigation mandates to work towards that, big game, whether it's jays or chickens, milkfetch, and other near threatened plants, cultural needs from a tribal standpoint, recreational needs, and also thinking about that persistent Pinyon-Juniper woodland ecological function into the future, and supporting recruitment and that future woodland as well. So, and I think, this picture, which I just took several years ago, and I was like, oh, this is kind of neat. Like, it's really relevant because we've got managed woodlands in the back. We have a fire where everything died on the right, and we've managed sagebrush in the foreground. Lots of stuff comes together in lots of places. I think that additional challenges, some of the misunderstanding of the needs on the landscape, that continued perception and rhetoric of it's got to be one species or one ecosystem versus the other, I think it's largely unrealized. I think it's generally inaccurate. And that's certainly unproductive to everybody that's interested in whether it's PJ or sage or big game or whatever. It doesn't matter. Yes, there's certainly likely trade-offs in places. And that's okay. This is a big, complicated, overlapping Intermountain West series of ecosystems. But I think a lot of the extent of those potential overlaps is less than we think it is, especially if we take that big picture look. If we look at the Intermountain West and we look at PJ, persistent PJ, the ecotones with sagebrush, grasslands, the changes that we're seeing now within sagebrush and the climate challenges there, the same within PJ, or some of these changes that we may or may not want to see on the landscape. But looking at taking that view to plan into the future, or we risk missing the boat on something, or allocating too much resources on one thing and having unintended negative consequences or impacts on something else. So, there's a way of taking a holistic management approach, I think, is one way that we could have a collective understanding of the complexity of the Intermountain West. I like to say that it's like, yes, it's like the entire Western landscape, but these are overlapping, interacting ecosystems that we're trying to balance. Through a holistic approach, we could work towards Pinyon-Juniper woodland ecosystem function, ecological function in the future, not just now, but thinking centuries down the road, but also meeting objectives in sagebrush and that ecotone, and with grasslands in the Southwest, the PJs being managed for grasslands. And so the idea behind this is bringing partners together with all the different diverse interests and backgrounds, mandates or whatever within a particular geography. We're not talking the entire Intermountain West, but within a part of a state or a part of a bird conservation or region or watershed, whatever, to be determined. But within that geography, discuss all of its values and sit down, whether it's sage or sagebrush integrity, sage grouse, jays, pygmy rabbits, Pinyon-Juniper woodland conservation needs, cultural needs, big game, all of those. And through that, sort of having that open, honest conversation, I think we agree that all those values are important. There's absolutely no question about that. They're all really important, but it would provide a better understanding of all the viewpoints. Hey, ideally bringing down some of those walls of concerns about we need to do something here or there, but take that big picture approach, take those ecosystem approaches, look into the future of where should we figure out what should we do on the landscape, not just for resources now, but down into the future as well. Super simple. But then, we can develop targets and thresholds for different species or ecosystems or woodland or structures or whatever it is that the priority is, whether it's wetlands or whatnot. And we can look at sage priority areas where sage grouse leks are and the migration corridors. And we have all that. We've got all of that stuff worked out. And we're coming up with the Jay models coming soon. And high use areas for jays and overlapping that stuff. I bet you there's not a whole lot of overlap when we really dig down into it and look at what's on the ground, or bring in other management objectives and priorities, because there's a lot. But I think a review of what we're doing and why we're doing it, the types of treatments that we're doing, and those approaches, discuss what's worked or what didn't work. I mean, we don't know if it's worked or not, because post-management monitoring is unfortunately, poorly funded. But I suspect we'd be able to find a lot of commonalities across these objectives, whether it's big game, thinking in persistent PJ of big game, fuels and fire, jays, woodland ecological function. It's less of a siloed kind of approach, but if we take that ecosystem approach and think about how we can manage those woodlands, I think we could meet a lot of objectives concurrently. Obviously, there'd be trade-offs in some places here and there, but by and large, I think we'd take a slightly different approach and be a little bit more effective. And so having some sort of agreed upon plan or strategy, whatever you want to call it, could allow for more effective resource allocation. And if anything, partners and the huge numbers of partners would better understand where everybody's coming from and what they have to do and where they need to do it. And we can potentially meet different goals at the same time, rather than having just single species or single management objective approaches. Taking the big picture could be a more effective way. So, this, in the end here, this could help prioritize PJ woodland values, which we're seeing this ecosystem in a crisis. We definitely need to be thinking more about this woodland ecosystem and the species and the livelihoods that depend upon it, but also for sagebrush and sage grouse. All of these big time priorities in the Intermountain West, they're all important. And so, we're learning a ton. There's a ton of science coming, both on the J side, on the PJ side, and all that kind of stuff. It's just an adaptive process. As we continue to learn, hopefully we can get more stuff funded so we can, learn more specific things to help us do our jobs better. In the end, the goal is, in my mind, is being more collaborative, taking that big view approach, potentially refine or tweak what we're doing, whether it's active or passive management, and trying to increase our efficiency towards collective habitat and species goals. And I think it boils down to being more proactive on conservation. I think it's sort of why we got into J stuff almost 7 years ago. It's like, ooh, this bird is not doing good. We should start, to get ahead of the thing here, rather than being reactive. And a lot of this, what we're doing is trying to be like that. I think we need to continue that and reinforce that, we're trying to be proactive to prevent a listing and prevent catastrophic wildfires or whatever. But obviously this is not easy. So just to wrap up, I know I covered a lot of stuff very quickly, quite a whirlwind of information, but lots of take homes here. I mean, there's a lot of science on the J side, on the bird side, and on the woodland side that are in the works. Every few days, my Google Scholar lights up with another paper on Pinyon-Juniper woodlands and something related to PJ. I can't hardly keep up with it. It's awesome to see this coming. One of the other keys is bridging the gap between J science and the PJ woodland experts and the climate science and the management community. We're all doing good work, but we need to try to bring it together and be thinking into the future. And then, continuing to support the bird work, the work of, Alliers and Ian's and the Jasons that are doing all of this stuff in the woodlands. We desperately need this information in the woodland ecosystem. And if we could possibly overlay Jays, I'm all over that. See if we can't figure out, how Jays are being impacted positively or negatively by what we're doing, and how we're trying to do better in woodlands. But, as I've said many times, Jays are just one piece. They're just one value in a very big puzzle. And if Jays can help drive some of this, that's great. But this isn't a Jay thing. This is a woodland ecosystem thing. There's so many important values in the Intermountain West, both in PJ and all the other ecosystems I've talked about. So, thinking about it, a holistic approach, give you that big picture vision, thinking about the entire Western landscape, and how it could be a little bit more effective to ensure we maximize our resources for the collective greater good, and benefit the important management objectives that we have that we're working towards. Well, that is it.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Scott. That was excellent presentation. I forgot to mention, we have a formal Q&A now, and we have a lot of time, right? But at noon Mountain, we'll stop recording and get into a more informal session for 15-20 minutes. If any of you is interested in being part of that, please feel free to join. So it looks like folks are very attentive while you were speaking, so no comments or questions in the chat.
Well, that's good.
But I have changed the settings so you can unmute and also share your video. We'll just stop the screen share now and just get into a Q&A session. Just feel free to unmute and ask your question. You should be able to unmute yourself. Question came up in chat. What are your thoughts on threat concerns in the Oregon area? What can we be doing?
No, Kelly, good question. Yeah, I think that's a big unknown. We kind of generally know where jays are up there. We know they're nesting in ponderosa pine. But that's about it. I've talked to, I think we've been on some emails and we've talked to some of the folks up there that are doing some banding and seeing if we can't start asking some of those questions about we're at square one with jays up there and trying to figure out where they are and what those potential threats may be. We don't really have a handle on trends or what's going on with them up there. So kind of square one, sort of the edge of range, but thinking losing PJ in the Southwest, like those northern states, the sort of edge of range now that may not be core of the population may become much more important into the future. Good question. Hopefully we can get some work going on up there and start asking some of those questions.
Yeah, it looks like the next question from Brian is really kind of getting into that point that what are you seeing on the northern range of the PJ expansion? Is there any indication emerging at this time?
No, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't think we've specifically looked at that yet, but part of it is we still need to figure out where jays are and where nesting colonies are. I'm starting to monitor some of that stuff over time. And as we're getting into new places where we don't have that kind of information, and some of this is potential expansion, I guess we'd have to take a look at that and start to figure out those questions. I mean, that's a big question. We lose much of Arizona and New Mexico. We're seeing that in places where the pinions have died and the jays have left. They're now nesting in ponderosa pine, which they historically didn't do. So adaptable, but maybe not good. But like, if we're losing that stuff, are they going to be able to meet their needs somewhere else? And we just don't have, we're at square one on some of that basic information in a lot of those northern states and some of that new stuff. So it's a good question, Brian.
Thais has a question around any thoughts about communities of practice to bring the bird, PJ scientists, land managers together?
That's a great question, Thais. We have had some conversations of how to do that. And I think we sort of have a framework sort of through that holistic idea to be able to do that, to bring a lot of the folks together from those different diverse backgrounds and interests in the Western landscapes, start having that conversation. So I think we'll eventually get there. There are workshops, at least on the PJ side, and now I'm attending some of those. So I'm like the bird guy and with all the woodland folks and the climate folks. So we're starting to get there. We need to expand on that as we go.
Question from Kathy. And Kathy, thanks for putting that link earlier on the drivers of mass production. So question is, there's a lot of juniper and PJ clearing on Western rangeland, particularly on BLM lands. Are you in the working group with BLM, working with BLM to bring in the needs of the jays and other PJ birds?
Yeah, definitely. When I was talking about some of the research that the graduate students are doing, I don't know that I specifically said that, but all this work is largely in these heavily managed areas where we already know there were jays from previous surveys. But BLM or Forest Service, whomever, the state folks are a part of the projects from the beginning, looking at the managed landscapes, what we're doing, how that could potentially be impacting jays, and learning with the folks that are making the decisions on the ground. I mean, at this point, the guidance that we have is like, try not to cut down nesting colonies, because that's the one thing we know that would be beneficial to jays, is to not cut down where they're nesting. But the rest of it's sort of we need to learn from what we're doing so we can make any kind of suggestions of potentially doing something different. But yes, Kathy, so we're working with all the folks on the ground with all these projects. Lots of folks are involved from day one on a lot of this stuff. So yeah, really important part. So post-fire use, that's a good question. I'm thinking back, I know there were areas where jays have started caching pine nuts in areas that have burned, because they like it, sort of south facing, a little bit more open, so the snow melts so they can pull pine nuts back out more easily in winter. I know they spent some time nesting in and around a burned area in New Mexico, which was really unusual because the tree was completely dead and there was an active jay nest in it. Clearly that was a one-off. Maybe they were super desperate. I don't really know. But I think that's part of the big question is, as these disturbance events occur, what are jays using? Are they using them at all? Are they completely avoiding them? Maybe they use them 10 years down the road. There's been some woodland treatments that were really thick, and jays started cashing in after they removed, opened it up a lot, made it more suitable for them. So lots of questions, very site specific, very challenging, to say the least.
I think there's another related question from Travis. What are the historical number of PJs? Are fires playing a factor, both good or bad? And I've noticed increased number of birds of prey in our area. Are they a factor? I guess you covered some of these things.
No, good question. I touched on it a little bit with like the trends stuff. We don't have data on jay populations before 1967. And certainly they fluctuated over the millennia. We're seeing the strong declines for lots of reasons that I kind of went into, as this ecosystem is just changing in the bad direction for jays. Fires, it depends on the severity and the extent. I mean, we're seeing a lot of large stand replacing fires where we're not going to get PJ back in there with trees that are producing mast for centuries, potentially. Maybe we never get it back. If it gets hot and dry, we're never going to get trees growing back in there. So potentially that's pretty bad, but small light fires where we're removing some of the extra litter that could lead to a stand replacing fire probably isn't a bad thing, right? It's certainly on the list of things that we need to better understand.
Scott, you mentioned the Mesa Verde example. Was that an example of a pretty severe fire? And it's been decades, nothing has come back, right?
Yeah, I mean, we see that in ponderosa pine as well. These just hot, dry, poor soils. Things take a long time to come back. And when I think about it from like a tree perspective, if you had 100,000 acre fire, where's that pinyon seed going to come from? Jay's going to have to fly in and cache it, and the situation's going to have to be right. It's going to have to be shaded under something else that's still growing or behind a down tree, and it's got to be wet at the right time because the seed viability is only a year or so. You need that seed source. You need what came first, the pinyon or the jay? I don't know, right? But we need that, essentially. So yeah, it's a challenging dispersal for those species is a challenge, particularly in huge areas, large areas. Well, let's see one more question here.
Yeah, from Duke. We are working on a landscape analysis of forest management using a conditions-based management approach and incorporating all of this through RAD framework, climate lens. Besides Noel's paper, are there other references or tools you recommend?
No, that's a good one. That's something else. If I had like 10 more minutes, I would have got into the RAD stuff a little bit, but so Miranda Redmond and Ali Erza had a paper, I think it was Bob Shriver, that came out last year that kind of touched on that stuff as well in terms of like what to do within PJ. I haven't quite gone down this route enough yet. It's something I need to get into a little bit more. So no, that's a good question. I'm still the bird guy, learning all the tree stuff, learning all the climate stuff. So I'm still sort of getting my feet wet in this, but no, I'd be interested in some other tools and references that will be useful here. So I don't have a good answer.
See more papers coming out. Thank you for sharing papers. Again, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions if that's easy. I see another question here in chat by Andrew. Is there any way that we could access the shapefile for Pinyon Jay range?
Once we get it all done and written up, we'll make it widely available. But we're not quite there yet.
Well, another fire question there. Is stand replacing fire common in PJ woodlands? I have heard from firefighters that it takes some very extreme conditions for fire to be very severe. Is there any analysis on recent fire behaviors?
I'm not sure about the last part of that about analysis, but we've seen lots of big fires, largely in areas where canopy cover is pretty high. The trees are pretty close together. You get those windy conditions, it's just blowing right on through. Just generally speaking, I think historically, those open woodlands, when there's big gaps between all the trees, fires tended to be less frequent. and of smaller scale, but a couple acres from a lightning strike, not 50 or 100,000 acres. Pretty site specific, but yeah, I mean, you need pretty extreme winds, really dry conditions, really denser woodlands that are going to be able to carry that fire. But we're starting to see a lot more of that. Just kind of, you can download all the shapefile for all the fires that have occurred in the last 25 years through BLM. And wow, those were pretty dense areas. So I think certainly something to dig into a little bit.
Question from Cameron here. Have you any thoughts or changing thoughts on the utility of Pinyon Jay as an umbrella species for other Pinyon-Juniper
You
associates?
use
or
the U
obligates?
word. No, that's a good question. I mean, we sort of, for years, sage grouse has sort of been perceived as that, like, sort of that umbrella species for sagebrush, and maybe that's true, maybe that's not. Kind of in the same situation with jays. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. They're probably planting a lot of the pinyons that we see. They planted those seeds back in the day, maybe a couple hundred years ago. I think generally speaking, since they use the landscape and are using all those different types of woodland structures, within a home range of Pinyon Jays, you've got gray flycatchers and juniper titmice and national flycatchers and black-throated gray warblers and green-tailed towhees, and there's niches for a lot of the other species. And so maybe I haven't dug into that, but I've thought about it a little bit. It seems, maybe that's the case, but each species, I mean, I'm just thinking birds, each of those individual birds have drivers as well. And, maybe we're missing something that's not always present within a jay home range. It's a good question, Cameron.
Oh, questions keep coming. Good.
Right.
There's another one from Houston. Is there room or need to advance citizen science to promote data collection across the landscape?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Great Basin Bird Observatory a few years ago rolled out a community science project. So it's not super rigorous survey protocol like what the working group has developed, but it's very there's a bunch of training that goes involved. It's not just going out and doing an eBird checklist or something. You're recording behaviors. You try to get out there a couple times, and that's led to filling information gaps in places where we don't have any bird data. It's led, I know it's at least in Colorado, it led to a couple of new nesting colonies that we didn't know about. So it takes a little bit of work and a little bit of training, but I think there's a great opportunity there. They already have the database and protocols and all that kind of stuff worked out. So I think we're hoping to get that started in Oregon. Not me, but our Oregon partners are hoping to have that conversation, see if we can't rope in some Audubon members to go out to some of these spots, sort of adopt an area to start to understand if there's jays in that area, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think there's a great opportunity for some not just regular old birding, but a little bit more rigorous observations through community science. I think it's potentially a pretty helpful tool. Definitely. And I can share the information on that stuff. Place can probably throw it in the chat as well if anybody was interested. No, they've been great.
Right, maybe we'll take one last question in this formal session. One more question from Luke here. We are suggesting basing management actions on Pinyon Jay habitat. Are there references you would suggest for habitat characteristics for jays?
Well, that is a loaded question if I've gotten one today. Every site is different. Every state is different. Every geography is different. If you look at pictures of the different nesting colonies that we have across just Colorado and Utah that I'm familiar with, they're all different in tree size, tree density, composition of pinyons or junipers, or I mean, I've been in some areas in central Colorado, it's just all pinyon. After walking around for a couple hours, it's like I haven't seen a juniper. They're all different. And so we have some basic information in the Pinyon Jay conservation strategy. It's just general stuff. We've talked for years with BLM and others to try to come up. There's no cookie cutter anything from a jay standpoint. Generalizations of woodland structure, but you need a little of all that stuff. The dense stuff, you need real open woodlands. There's some recent data from a master's student in New Mexico where jays were kind of, when they're foraging, they tend to not be in PJ. They're in more open areas with less trees. So it depends what you're interested in, whether it's nesting colonies versus foraging or caching, all that kind of stuff. There's a lot to it. And I hope we can get to some general guidelines, which probably are not very different from target objectives for big game or fuels or something like that. But thinking about it from that woodland perspective, resources change, whether it's food or water, whatever is driving their occurrence in the landscape, constantly changing. So you need to have that that functional, all that heterogeneous woodlands that's still functional, across a large area, so they can shift around as those resources shift around. I mean, colonies tend to be in the same area for potentially decades, but they do up and move. So we have to think big. So that's hard question to answer, but good question, Luke.
I think you did well there. Well, we can put more hard questions to Scott in this informal session coming up. So again, I'll stop the recording, and please feel free to join this informal session for a little more discussion on this topic. And thank you again, everyone, for joining and asking your questions and bringing your comments. And I really want to thank our speaker, Scott. Scott, thank you again for an excellent presentation. I'll stop the recording at this point.